So I want to talk about the Industrial Revolution, and as with all great movements, I suppose we need to set some sort of date for the Industrial Revolution. And again, like the Agricultural Revolution, there's a variety of dates that we could possibly take on this. What we can do is set probably a beginning, probably not before 1750. I did read some years ago of some people suggesting that some of the windmills back in the 10th century should be classified as an industrial revolution. And while things may have changed because of it, I don't think you can draw a line going back that far. So probably not before 1750. But from about the 1760s onwards, we start seeing a large number of patents being applied for, which means that there is an increase in technological prowess and use. And so we can start out in the 1760s. We can probably end in about the 1830s, potentially, which is when steam engines are widely used. And by steam engines, I mean railways, not just engines that are sitting in situ. By 1850, most of the railways are finished, so that probably gives us an end date. So those are our two sort of dates. So we have an industrial revolution, but of course it's not necessarily seen as that, and it's not called that until much later. So we have people at the time talking about this, and I have here Andrew Ure writing in his book in 1835. So this is sort of near the end of it, where he says that this island is preeminent amongst civilized nations for the prodigious development of its factory wealth. And he's closely followed, or rather, not necessarily closely followed chronologically, but he's followed by Patrick Colquhoun, who says this: it's impossible to contemplate the progress of manufacturers in Great Britain within the last 30 years without wonder and astonishment. Its rapidity exceeds all credibility. The improvement of the steam engines, but above all, the facilities afforded to the great branches of the woolen and cotton manufactories by ingenious machinery, invigorated by capital and skill, are beyond all calculations. So it's clear that something is going on. The Chambers Encyclopedia in 1849 writes that in the point of national industry, England stands unrivaled by any other country in the globe. And this is actually true. This isn't really exaggeration. This isn't hyperbole. And perhaps the best way to sort of visualize some of this is to have a look at the Crystal Palace exhibition. This is called the Great Exhibition. And in 1851, they built what was essentially a giant greenhouse out. It was done by Joseph Paxton and Charles Fox, who put together this almighty thing made out of iron and glass, which and that requires an awful lot of engineering. You can't just sort of throw things together and hope they stick. This thing was amazing. 14,000 exhibitors turned up, 28 countries, 13,000 exhibits, all showing the greatness of Great Britain and what it could and could not do. Well, sorry, what it could do. But of course, nobody has a term for any of this. You've got stuff happening, you've got things happening. Nobody really has a term. And it's really up to the Englishman's great rivalry, the French here. Oops, sorry. Who really are talking about this. Let me bring up my thing here. The French here are the ones who talk about a revolution industrielle. This is Jacques Adolphe Blanqui in 1826. They are the ones who really talk about it. And I just realized that I haven't had my slides running, so I'm going to run back a little bit. Now, here's Crystal Palace. I just realized. As you can see, there's plenty of glass, plenty of iron in this. It's very sumptuous. It all burned down in a fire, which is why we no longer have it. But I still think the area is called that. We have a football team called Crystal Palace, and I think it all goes back to this. This is Patrick Colquhoun, and here is Andrew Ure. So these are the two we were just quoting from. So we have we have a series of people anyway who talk about this. And they know something's going on, but they don't really have the term for it. And so the question is, why do we think something has happened? As I alluded to earlier, we have things happening in Britain. There are patents and machines being built and used. But so what? What does this actually mean? Why do historians think that something actually took place? And so we'll sort of go through this sort of chronologically. We can start out with Friedrich Engels, who lived in Manchester, which was a very large industrial town in 1842, sorry. And he wrote a book called The Condition of the Working Classes in 1844, in which he talks about the culmination of technological improvements. And he starts out with the spinning jenny. I don't think oh no, I do have a quote from him. So let me just put the quote up here. I don't like reading things on a screen, but I will read this as well. Now, this is a bit of a word salad, but never mind. The invention made it possible to deliver more yarn than heretofore, whereas though one weaver had employed 3 spinners, there had never been enough yarn, and the weavers had often been obliged to wait for it. There was now more yarn to be had than could be woven by available workers. Now that the weaver could earn more at his loom, he gradually abandoned his farming and gave his whole time to weaving. By degrees, the class of farming weavers wholly disappeared and was merged in the newly arising class of weavers who lived wholly upon wages, had no property whatsoever, and so became working men, proletarians. So Engels is really pointing the finger at technological inventions. Things like the spinning jenny, as we said, Richard Arkwright's spinning throstle and carding machine. These are all things for agricultural improvements. Joseph Cartwright's power loom, James Watt's steam engine. And this is one of the sort of the very traditional understandings about the Industrial Revolution, that it is technologically driven. It makes a certain number of misleading assumptions, for example, the substitution of capital for labor. But really, it talks about savings in a number of different areas, firstly in terms of capital. And a lot of this is unintentional, right? So think of a steam engine. A steam engine is a fairly complex machine, and so its cost is actually quite expensive. But you can replace it. You can use it to replace lots of horses, whereas horses need downtime and feeding. In theory, steam engines just need maintenance. And so because you're no longer spending money on your horses, you now have money that you can be putting into other places. And so this is what we call a liberation of capital. We also need to talk about some of the techniques. There are savings in techniques in, well, energy supply, for example. We are swapping coal for wood. Wood, of course, you have to go and find a tree, you have to chop it down, you have to do things to it. And it is not very compact, and it might be slightly easier to get hold of rather than than something in a coal mine. But there are a finite number of trees, and you can only do so much burning. So we're swapping things over. We're saving things when it comes to energy. We're saving things with well, logistics. We are using networks of travel and transport to make things happen. And this is all good, all right, because you have now extra money floating around because you're making savings in all these different areas. Time is also something that's saved. There is an increasing awareness of time. Factory workers understood the need for punctuality, for well, employers needed to know when things were going to be delivered, when things were due. And so you had to make sure that a lot of what was going on in your factory and all the things coming in and out of the factory were all on a very sort of timely basis. And you could save time. The introduction of chlorine, for example, you could bleach clothes. If any of you have spilled bleach on your clothing, you will know how very quickly that thing can turn white. You can now do within a couple of hours what used to take months in the sun beforehand, which you sort of had to leave things outside for it to bleach. So there are little things that can happen, and Engels kind of pointed all of this out. The problem was he wrote this in German. And the book is actually Die Lage die Arbeiterklasse in England, which was roundly ignored by the British because we don't like foreigners. The book was actually translated in 1885. But of course, that's well after the industrial period has, as far as we know, sort of finishes. So it really falls down to a man called Arnold Toynbee, who kind of, I suppose, popularized the term. He did Oxford lectures in 1881 and 1882. And he wrote, well, these were lectures on the Industrial Revolution in England. And his view was that between 1760 and 1840, there was a fundamental transformation in the economy. There was a change in population, which I think I talked about in a previous lecture, but if I didn't, there was an increase in population, and population shifts around the country too. There is a change in agriculture. These lead to changes in industry, the social lives of the poor. We replaced guilds and regulation with capitalist competition. Once upon a time, guilds would control particular, would have a monopoly over particular working areas. So, for example, let's say you produce cloth. You would be part of a guild, and that guild would set and control cloth production, cloth selling, and who could sell cloth. All of this disappears with the replacement of capitalist competition. As he said, quote, "The wealth of nations and the steam engine destroyed the old world and built a new one." And really from then on, people start talking about the Industrial Revolution. And what we have really is everything after this is kind of reactions to this, right? Maybe, as the little slide says there, well, was this really revolutionary? And was it industrial? I mean, this is really how history tends to be written, right? Somebody says something, and then the academy responds to it. The worst thing that can happen to you as an academic is that your work sinks into obscurity. So you want people to talk about it, and you want people to argue with you simply because it keeps the whole thing alive, and also helps us understand a little better what is going on. So there are a couple of people who write about this, or who respond to this in the 20th century. So the first person here is Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote a book called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy in 1942. And he talks about well, there are 5 industrial revolutions, in fact. And I'm not going to tell you all the details about it because it's not particularly germane or useful to you just at the moment as to what each of these is. But there are long waves of economic activity, and each of them consists of some sort of industrial revolution, right? So that's his one. And then we've sort of got in the interwar period, we've got some critiques that begin to look at the pace and the extent of the Industrial Revolution. So H. Heaton, for example, who talks about the long-term origins of change, these slow durations of industrialization. You know, if you have a revolution, you normally expect it to be fairly done quickly. But the Industrial Revolution, according to almost everybody so far, is something that takes place over 100 years. Well, that's not really a revolution, is it? It's kind of what you need. You need a different label to talk about it. Sir John Clapham, he responded and said, well, if you look at the cotton industry, this was partially revolutionized by 1850. Well, that's pretty late. Half of the population lived in areas untouched by industrialization as late as 1850. So what is this? It's not a revolution. This is gradual change. This isn't sort of quick stuff. And then we have a couple of other people who talk about multiple industrial revolutions. E.M. Carus Wilson, for example, he puts a possible industrial revolution back in the 13th century. He says the changes to the fulling mills count as an industrial revolution. Don't quite believe him, don't quite follow him, and I don't think anybody else does. But these are kind of interesting ideas. Like, how do you tell what actually affects change in a country, and what technology makes that happen? John Neff said there was an industrial revolution in the coal industry between 1540 and 1640. This was the Industrial Revolution. It's in piecemeal. It happens here, there. And in the 1950s, we get some other people. Walt W. Rostow, who's an anti-communist. He writes The Process of Economic Growth. And this is in 1953. And he says, look, there are three different kinds. Well, the three essentials of growth, what you have to have. You have to develop a fundamental science, right? In other words, you've got to understand chemistry and physics. And then you've got to take the things that you've learned and then apply that to economic ends for it to happen. And you also need a propensity to accept innovations and inventions. And this is the linchpin of modern history, right? All other countries had to emulate this as far as he was concerned. Simon Kuznets emphasized the role of science in powering industry, right? So James Watts's steam engine is the main thing, because this really is the thing that changes how power changes how we manage to make and do things. And he says the wealth of nations comes through applied scientific knowledge, not labor and capital, right? And so this is sort of contra Engels and some of the other earlier people. And then when we go to the 1960s, we have some more famous people, and I'll put them up here. E.P. Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm. Now, this is the, I guess this is the time when you start seeing Marxists come into the academy. And I don't want to use it as some sort of bogey word, but really just to point out that there is a shift in how people look at things. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, I'm just saying there's a shift. So E.P. Thompson writes writes The Making of the English Working Class, which is an absolutely seminal work, because for the very first time, people are actually, or he is actually looking at working class people. Everybody else is talking about science, or they're talking about labor and capital, whatever it is. He's actually looking at the people and what actually happens to them. And it's a great book, you should read it. And Eric Hobsbawm, again, another really important writer, said that the Industrial Revolution marks the most fundamental transformation of human life in the history of the world recorded in written document. This is probably true in many ways, although maybe might be some other things that come close to this. But what they do is they base all of this on the wages of craftsmen. It allows them to look at social change, right? So when the textile industries begin to alter and do things, it throws the family into chaos because of it, because the neat family systems that we used to have are now completely exploded by the requirements of factories and, as I talked about earlier, things like deadlines and things like this. Recreational sport is destroyed. People used to play things and do things together. Now it's all work, 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 work. And all of this relies on a revolution that's sort of greatly transformative, a type of revolution that's transformative. A.E. Musson, sorry, getting his name wrong there, writes a book called The Growth of British Industry, where he says that the notion of a short and cataclysmic industrial revolution is clearly no longer tenable. And he details the agencies that are responsible for the diffusion of science and technology. So he looks at philosophical societies, itinerant lecturers who would go around from place to place talking about things, books and periodicals, in other words, information. And then what we had were two people who appeared, Nix and Harley. These were what we call revisionists, and the 1970s and 80s was very big on revisionism in all areas. It's not just in this area, but in all sort of historical areas. There is a very big change, probably starting in the 60s, but definitely hitting us hard in the 70s and 80s. Anyway, Nick Crafts, he looks at the growth rates in the 1770s to 1830s, and he says there's a much slower growth taking place here. And Nick Harley also critiqued the overestimation of growth in the period between 1770 and 1815. In other words, this is a problem, right? Because all previous work to them is based upon this concept of a watershed in human existence. Something major has happened, and it has changed everything. And what they're saying is, well, actually, not much is changing at all. So what is going on? Because we do have some transformations. There's, if you look at economic history and social history, there is something happening. Now, the revisionism is challenged by a couple of historians who questioned the data, but also contested the approach to the data that Crafts and Harley had adopted. And they sort of said, amongst other things, that the Industrial Revolution is a phenomenon of regional development. And so it's actually kind of hard to use national statistics, because what's really happening is at a small, not necessarily small, but is happening at a local level. And everybody's using national aggregated statistics saying, okay, how does the country work? And, they shouldn't be doing this because the effects are in smaller areas than this. Tom Wrigley, also in the 1980s, wrote a lot about coal. I know that doesn't necessarily sound very exciting, but it actually is. Because what he says is that coal frees you from geographical and climatical requirements. If you think about power in before the Industrial Revolution, power is based on things like wind or water or horses. But if you haven't got a big enough stream, you can't run a watermill. So you are sort of constrained by your geography. Horses are a power, but you have to feed them, and they need, sleeping at night and whatnot. Charcoal is a power, but you need land to grow trees to convert into charcoal, and they take a long time. Trees take decades to grow. Coal, on the other hand, is power anywhere you want. If you can take a barrel load of coal somewhere, and you can make it do something. And so his suggestion is that the population grows, mostly because we don't need the land to produce power anymore. We could use the land for something else. And so, yeah, between the 1990s and 2000s, David Landers writes a book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, in 1988. Where he talks about rationality giving birth to modernity. And I talked a little bit about that in the Enlightenment lecture earlier. Max Weber comes back in. Max Weber wrote a book on the Protestant ethic. His argument is that Protestantism makes people work harder, and there are some issues with it. I don't really want to go too much into it. It's an interesting book. The idea is roughly that the Protestant nations embraced change, and whereas adapted and became something great. So if you look at all the powerhouses in Europe, they're all Protestant. So Germany, the Netherlands, the northern countries like, well, Sweden, Norway, they're not necessarily powerhouses, but England as well. Whereas if you look at all the Catholic countries, such as Italy and Spain and Portugal, they're not that great. And so his argument was that Protestantism did this. I think there's a certain amount of truth to it, but yeah. Anyway, so we've got this sort of potted history here. So we have to come to some sort of conclusion about this. And really, it comes down to a man called David Cannondine. And he wrote this, and I will read it because it really needs reading. The dominant interpretation which prevails in any given generation is never more than a partial view of that very complex process we inadequately refer to as the Industrial Revolution. In that it draws attention to some important aspect of the subject, it is never going to be wholly wrong, but in that it gives disproportionate emphasis to a limited number of considerations, and it's not likely to be wholly right either. Sorry. And so what he says is that each age has a particular preoccupation, and I kind of threw a slide here. The idea is that historians write about stuff. This is called historiography. And each age is concerned about a particular preoccupation. In other words, the people, because when you write something, you absorb the issues around your time period, and it works its way into your writing, whether you like it or not. So, for example, in the 1920s, everybody is well, social surveys and issues about poverty influences the interpretation about the Industrial Revolution. In the 1920s to 1950s, everybody's kind of worried about war, right? And wars require a fair amount of economic support to make happen. Currently, at the moment, Russia is desperately trying to keep its economy going. It's on a wartime economy because it's very difficult to keep the war going on in Ukraine. So likewise, the people in the 1950s had just come out of the first, I suppose, but also most recently, the Second World War. And because they're concerned with wars and economic fluctuations, they emphasize the cyclical nature of industrialization. But then between the 1950s and the 1970s, historians are influenced by the rise of development economics. So this is the post-war efflorescence of Western capitalism, right? And then the 1970s and 80s, economic growth is seen as less attractive and less attainable. The Industrial Revolution is something less revolutionary, but something more evolutionary. And so Calladine says in this sort of long, in that thing which I just said, look, every person writes a little bit of something, and it's probably going to be a bit right, but not all right, right? So you can't have that. And so we kind of go back to, I suppose, some of the causes of the British Industrial Revolution, right? And there's a laundry list version of this, right, where there is a growing demand due to population increase. And we know there is a population increase. It actually starts in the 1600s, 1500s, 1600s. So we've got a growing demand due to a population increase. We've got export growth. We've got changes in taste. People are wanting more things and different things. We have very efficient capital markets and a supply of capital. So we've got money, and we can do things with that money. We have very productive agriculture. It's getting a lot better. We have a base of artisanal and scientific skills and people willing to apply those skills to particular issues and questions. And we also have a stable government. And so this is often, what we sort of say is the laundry list of all of this. Now, I just want to sort of talk about some of the terms before we get into it. The three are labor, land, and capital. Land is normally a shorthand for all the products of the natural world. So everything that you bring from the sea, from the land, minerals, for example, these are all land, even though it is the sea. It's stuff. Labor is work. And capital really is just the funds to finance some productive asset, right? The asset itself. So if you want growth, not industrialization, you add inputs of one or more of these factors, right? But you kind of need more things to happen. If you want an industrial revolution, you need something a bit more. So, for example, you need economies of scale, right? So as ships increase in size, their cargo capacity increases as well. So the capital cost of building a ship doesn't rise as fast as its cargo capacity, okay? Neither does its crew size. And so therefore the labor of the crew is used more efficiently, and crude costs per ton carried will be a lot smaller. So in other words, ships, if you go back to the 1500s and 1600s, ships, loads of people on a ship, ships can't carry very much. And that sort of alters itself as we go through history. Ships get better and the crews get smaller. And nowadays, you can run an entire ship on very few people, really large, industrial ships. So we've got economy scales. We've got more economic transactions between firms and individuals. For example, ships spend less time waiting in port for a cargo as traffic grows. So the more things you have coming into a port, the quicker your ship can get out again. more letters will become written, which means you want some sort of very efficient and very common postal service. I think in London, when the postal service still was beginning, there were 6 deliveries a day. Now we get 2, probably because we send fewer things, but it's just kind of interesting to see how much has changed. So there are gains from trade as well. And gains from trade is really, at its simplest, it's the principle that if 2 partners, each producing a different product more cheaply than the other, exchange these products, both partners will gain so long as transaction costs are lower than the savings in production costs, right? So this is kind of like heavy economic stuff. Don't worry too much about it. I just want you to get some of these ideas sort of floating around. And so there's all these things here that sort of have to take place. And our models, really, right? Our models are this. There are kind of 2 main models for the British Industrial Revolution. And the simplest model is the growth of capital, the growth of capital as a motive for growth, right? And in other words, we have a buildup of assets, things. Now, there are fixed assets. Fixed assets are things like, well, roads. They don't go anywhere. They need repairing, but they don't go anywhere. But ships, tools, machinery. And then we have circulating capital. This is things like stocks of raw materials or goods in production or goods currently unsold, okay? And to get this growth, the purchasing needs to exceed the rate of things that they wear out. You know, at its basic thing, you need to buy things before the things that you have run out. All of us have things in our house that we don't use, or we bought once and only used it once. That's growth. We need people to buy things they don't need. And there's actually some very interesting books written by, I think it's Stuart Ewan, or is it Ewan Stewart? He writes some books on capitalism and marketing. And he goes to show that how factories at the turn of the 20th century, so in the 1900s, they begin to realize that they are producing so much stuff that we have to get people to buy it. So how to get people to buy stuff they don't need? And you know, it's a really interesting thing. I think it's his statistic, but it may be somebody else, but they said that 6% of the shoe factories in the US produced enough shoes for everybody else, which means that 94% of the factories in the US were producing unnecessarily. And yet people are still buying shoes, which is why, you know, you have 50 pairs of shoes in your house or something like that. Anyway, that's our purchasing needs to exceed the rate. Investment exceeds depreciation, in other words, right? So we tend to associate the Industrial Revolution with capital assets such as textile machines and steam engines. And it seems logical that if you give workers these kinds of assets, then they should produce more. But there's a point of diminishing returns, as we talked about earlier. Land can only give you so much, right? You can only fit so many sheaths of corn on a plot of land. You can only grow so many carrots, right? You can't make carrots grow faster. You know, you can't just chuck them in one day and hope that they come out in a week's time. They take time. So methods can improve, but you can only farm so much. You can add people or fertilizer to make things happen. But again, a lot of your time is just sitting, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for something to happen, or doing things just to keep things from collapsing. And if you ever have a garden, you'll understand exactly what that means. So we have a sort of a development of a market economy, right? So people are moving away from subsistence farming to a market economy. And that means that I grow stuff in my garden and then I can take the excess to market and sell it, which admittedly is not necessarily a new thing. This, you know, you can look at the market towns during the medieval period, and you know, that's why it happens. But what we have is the market economy allows a specialization of functions. So farmer A, who lives in one place, let's say he lives up north in England, he can grow a specialized crop that is well suited to the north, so oats or something. Farmer B in the south can grow something different. We used to produce wine in England when the temperatures were a lot hotter. So you could then exchange your wine for oats, and you'd have some sort of economy going. This goes well with workers too. Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations, said that an extensive market leads to a greater division of labor, which is the key to higher productivity, right? So there are certain limits on this. And I talked about Tom Wrigley earlier, about how he points out that coal frees people from power restraint, because you're always reliant on something else to get things powered. With coal, you're not. All you have to do is just have the physical coal. So the use of coal enables woodlands to be turned into food production. Transport costs fall, because if you imagine, like, you want to get from the bottom of England to Scotland and you've got a horse and cart, it's going to take you a long while to get up there, and you can only carry so much, whereas a train will get there in a day or two, and you can carry so much more on a train, right? So as transport costs fall due to steam technology, land usage becomes much more specialized. And also there are lands overseas opening up, other markets. And this goes sort of hand in hand with imperialism, going to other people's countries and claiming it for yourself. So in a way, all of these things can give us some sort of clue as to how we might get it. So growth of capital as a motive for growth, all of these things sort of lead us to it. Sorry. The other option is a second model here, which is Karl Marx, his work. And Karl Marx writes his Capital. Let me just close my notes here. He sort of says, what you need is market expansion and capital accumulation and innovation. Capital accumulation, workers are not paid for what they're worth, right? And so imagine currently at the moment, there's a big debate on what wages should be. Should workers in McDonald's earn $15 an hour, right? And lots of people getting very angry about the fact that people should have enough to live on. And what they're doing is playing into exactly what Karl Marx was pointing out, right? When you are worth a certain amount, all right, and your capacity to live requires a certain amount of money, but employers don't pay you. They pay you a lot less. And so instead of giving you your $15 an hour to work at McDonald's, they give you $7. But that means they then have, $7 or $8 left over to then do other things. And so this is excess capital for investment. You screw your workers over, so you have lots of money to do whatever you want. And this is actually kind of followed up by a man called R.R. Rostow, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. He comes up with the idea of what we call a leading sector concept, right? Where he sort of says one sector of the economy is really, really important. High growth rates, right? A high growth rate means that you have excess capital to invest elsewhere. So let's look at cotton. Not only did it stimulate industrialization through demand, it also generated high profits, which could then be used for investment, right? So you take the things that you've gotten by producing your cotton and you plow it into something else. In Britain, the immediate reason was a rapid reduction in costs and prices and a huge expansion in sales. Okay, because if your cotton shirts used to cost £50 and I'm only earning £5 an hour, I have to wait 10 hours before I can sort of buy a shirt. But if that shirt pops down to £5 an hour, I can buy one shirt after 1 hour's work. And so that means I can now maybe buy 2 shirts because it's a lot cheaper to buy a shirt. And so we have an expansion in sales. So, so while the concept of a leading sector and capital accumulation are like really main ingredients to how Rostow thinks about the British Industrial Revolution, he also says that innovation is actually kind of really important too. Some other people weigh into this. Joseph Schumpeter, I think we met him a little earlier. He talks about entrepreneurship. Now, you might argue that some of these terms are very sort of narrow, and they are quite narrow. And in terms of whether you will ever use this information again, I can't really claim that you ever will, but you should know at least some of these terms, and things are quite specific, and there are specific arguments about this stuff. Anyway, so entrepreneurship in this particular case, right? He says entrepreneurship entails the possession of a special quality of foresight and a heightened ability to seize opportunities. So entrepreneurship was a function. An individual can only fulfill these things if only by possessing these particular attributes, right? So there are people who are capable of turning a profit, supernormal profits. Very clever people who are in at the right time and they know what they're doing. When it comes to innovation, he talks about discontinuities, right? The opening of new markets, the development of new sources of raw materials, and all of these things lead to profit opportunities. Entrepreneurs could capitalize on new machines before anyone else could. And you see there's people who early adopt things. They can do stuff with technology, and if they are very good at doing it, and so it produces, they can produce lots of money out of it well before everybody else. Entrepreneurs and innovation. Joel Mokyr, who actually writes actually some very interesting books on inventions, which are kind of worth reading. Like Shunter, he sort of says inventions create opportunities, right? In the macro, right, in the large, new inventions, things like the steam engine, the spinning jenny. In the micro, small improvements made to them. It's actually sort of been said that most of the time, the person who invents something isn't the one who benefits the most from it. It's the person who makes the tweaks to it, who makes it better. And you will actually see a lot of this floating around the internet. People who came up with a great idea, but somebody else had to tweak the idea to make it really take off. And those are the kinds of people you're looking for. Anyway, Mokyr says, once a number of inventions have been made, there are links between the various technologies, right? Which encourage further change. So steam engines encourage developments in metalworking technology, which in turn are fostered by better and cheaper iron. But this is also, in a way, fairly random. So there is a bit of effort, and you have to sort of get it there. But again, if you discover something and you figure something out, it's kind of pretty well, as Nicholas Kraft says here, like luck. He says this is all a load of rubbish. Well, not quite a load of rubbish. He says there's no particular reason why Great Britain should start the Industrial Revolution. France had much more scientific expertise and a textile industry. So he says basically the whole thing's an accident. With the French Revolution, the loss of colonial markets, and the Napoleonic War, Britain moves ahead and assumes dominance. Okay, so Britain and France have been fighting. The French lose, hooray. And Britain then basically takes dominance on the world stage through sort of sheer dumb luck. Had the French stayed around and not been involved, things would have been very different. So it's really easy to look back with hindsight and say, well, that would have happened, but we don't know if it would, but that could have happened. And then there's a third and last model, demand side models. This is the third model here, which is the idea that, as it says, different forces create demands, okay? So additional demands send out market signals, prices rise, and businessmen are motivated to invest. You see a gap in the market, you're like, okay, I'm going to plug that gap with my invention or my discovery or whatever. Why does this demand increase though? So there are several things. Firstly, population growth. Between 1750 and 1850, population rose between 7 to 20 million. Now, diminishing returns means that these people will be poorer, but maybe an increase in population encourages capital formation, right? So demands for housing go up because there's more people, rents go up. This encourages house building. Actually, thinking about that now, that really doesn't seem to happen. Everybody seems to be complaining about the increase in house prices, and there's no new houses. Anyway, J.M. Keynes wrote, the general theory of employment, interest, and money. Keynes's problem was the unemployment of the 1920s and 1930s. As money gets tight, you save, you don't spend. Nobody buys anything. There's low demand and there's less money available. And the solution is to get people to spend. So the government put money into the private sector to get demands for goods and services up and running. So the government primes the pump, so to speak. I think if I get, that's Keynes. Very important British sort of that. The other option is foreign trade. Foreign trade is obviously a stimulus, but war tends to get in the way. Currently, everything at the moment in Britain has gone up in price, and the same is in America and pretty much around the rest of the world, because things are very expensive, because Russia has been causing trouble in Ukraine. There are some issues going along in the Suez Canal, which has put prices up. We've just come out of a pandemic, which also put prices up. So, you know, things can get in the way. So foreign trade definitely helps out, but war interferes with it. And in Britain, because we're talking about a British Industrial Revolution, between 1750 and 1815, so over a 75-year period, Great Britain is at war with the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and the French Wars, both the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, right? And that means that you are spending valuable time and effort in areas that aren't producing anything. And that's not good. But war does produce things, right? Governments spend lots of money. They produce war products. Armed forces need salaries. And even if you conscript people in, you have to pay people. Russia at the moment is trying to do this. It's promising soldiers, people who join the Russian army to go fight in Ukraine, lots of money. They're not paying them. And most people die before they can collect anything. But it's what an example here of you've got to pay people salaries, right? You have to do something about that. But all of this stuff for war comes from taxation, right? Which reduces incomes, and so consumers are and reduces consumer spending and saving. So you might spend and you might increase in some areas, but it will decrease in other areas, right? War is not a great economic thing here. So those are our three sort of models of the Industrial Revolution, and more specifically, the causes of the British Industrial Revolution. And to be honest, I'm not going to push you into coming up with a conclusion about it, or even saying what you should think about it, just to let you know that that's roughly how it works. We've got different options for why industrial revolutions take place, lots of arguments about whether industrial revolutions take place. And that's not, it's a complicated thing. And if you don't come up with a total answer about this, I won't cry about it because it is so incredibly complicated. I think next week what we'll do is talk about some of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. There are two consequences to it. One are the reform movements that take place, and another one, I guess, leads us into questions to do with science and how that affects people's faith. But we'll talk about that in a few weeks' time.